I think there's an interesting gap between what you might call elite opinion, particularly among the securocrats, the defense, intelligence, foreign policy people, because they've been on a bit of a journey and they've come to see Iran actively helping Russia in Ukraine, for example. China doing the same, not quite in the same way, not sending missiles in the way that Iran has recently, but providing lots of microchips and sub-assemblies for drones and all this sort of stuff. And then North Korea too. And they refer to this as the axis of autocracies. And I think this has really changed the mood music, certainly in Washington.
I'm now joined by Mark Urban. Hello, Mark.
I am.
Mark is with us every Monday to talk through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. It's always good to have you with us, Mark. There's obviously, there's the big sort of foreign policy, diplomatic and defence story of the day is fairly obvious. As we've been discussing through the programme, it's exactly a year since more than 1,000 Israelis were killed by Hamas terrorists in attacks through southern Israel. It was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, and it's also the day that Israel began, or at least began to plan, its current war on Hamas. Top line vague question, your big reflections on the last year. Put it this way, are we where you expected we would be a year on?
No, I mean, I suppose I would have hoped that there would have been some kind of ceasefire or some kind of end or containment to it by now. I mean, I was there from 2 days after the events and reporting and talking to a lot of people. And I mean, it was immediately obvious. I mean, the first thing, which, we don't reflect that much on, but it is important to understand, is there was a huge failure of the Israeli military and intelligence apparatus that led to this. I mean, 300 of the 1,200 killed were military. In military terms, the Hamas operation to break out was very successful. Then, of course, what followed was murder and rape and all the rest of it. So it's a sort of double societal trauma for the Israelis. And when I was there, I straight away started to get quite a deep feeling of foreboding about what would happen because, in the Israeli mindset, surrounded by enemies, they often insist that they have to maintain what they call various things, but their deterrent power. Yeah. And clearly they'd failed. And the idea of re-establishing deterrence, which normally means one of these campaigns, as we've seen over the years in Gaza or in Lebanon in 2006, where there's a lot of bombing and all the, I thought, well, that's going to happen at the very minimum, but on a much larger scale, probably.
Basically a punitive campaign.
Yeah, a pounding, and in a sense, let's be clear about it, trying to bring about a societal resolve on the part of the people being bombed. My God, we don't want to do this again. Yeah. And just last week, I heard the Israeli ambassador, for example, saying about Lebanon that what they did in 2006 had bought them 18 years of calm. So that sort of mentality is quite prevalent among Israeli decision makers. So I did really fear what was going to happen. And, sadly, it's turned out that way. I think the salient thing in a way, and even in those first few days, I mean, it was no more than 4 days, I think, after it happened, the American Defense Secretary was visited and said publicly, to Benjamin Netanyahu, don't go for revenge, don't make the mistakes we made in Iraq, that type of thing. And that's what's clearly been so problematic throughout the last year, is the absence of a sort of attainable strategy. The Israelis can do all sorts of things, with lethality and military efficiency. But the question of what is their end state, what do they want to achieve there? And of course, critically, who on earth are they going to hand over to when they decide it is time to have a ceasefire?
Do you detect a sort of a marked shift between the kind of, I guess, the vagueness of the sort of the policy goals, the outcome in Gaza with what they're now doing in Lebanon? Because one gets the sense that Lebanon seems to be like a much more confident Israeli military operation.
Yes, it's a completely different picture in terms of all sorts of things, societally within Lebanon, in terms of international law. I mean, you can argue that all Israel really wants is an enforcement of the UN Security Council resolution that ended that 2006 war with Lebanon, which actually says that, for example, Hezbollah mustn't be south of this river, the Litani River, which is about 25 kilometres north of the Israeli border. So that has never really been enforced. And the Israelis now say they're on the ground to enforce that. So in that sense, what they're doing in Lebanon goes with the grain of previous international law and previous international declarations. And they know, of course, that lots of forces outside the Shia community, particularly in Lebanon, and the Christians, Druze, or whatever, actively despise Hezbollah and want it to stop. So it's a very different picture to the one in Gaza, where you've got this awful kind of zero-sum existential conflict from both sides.
If we sort of, just to sort of drill down a bit more into that, if we sort of look at the conflict in Gaza as being more or less a kind of sort of ad hoc thing that Israel brought into being soon after the attack on October the 7th, and has kept on going in sort of, with horrendous consequences and perhaps with vague aims. And we contrast that with what's happening in Lebanon, where they seem to have known what they were doing. This had been what they would do in the eventuality that they had to do anything had been planned from a long time. And one would imagine that from the moment that Hezbollah started firing rockets last year, Israel knew, okay, eventually, step by step, this is what we're going to do. How would you then move on from that to talk about what appears to be looming with Iran? Is that something that you would think Israel has been really, really intensely wargaming for really quite a long time, and so they know stage by stage
they have
what they would do?
I'm sure they have. I mean, I think what's happened is, this is almost like a sort of nest of Russian dolls or whatever. You started off with the Hamas attack on Israel, and then very soon afterwards, really the next day, Hezbollah started attacking Israel as well, and it became clear that Iran wanted to use its proxies, not exactly to bring on an all-out war, but aggressively. They would say to leverage the Palestinian cause, but I think all sorts of other agendas there, including reinforcing this sense of Iranian leadership that they would like to be felt across the Middle East. And so that's made things much more complicated because, as we know, Hezbollah is the sort of jewel in the crown of their proxy network. In many ways, it plays a role as a deterrent for Iran vis-a-vis, for example, their nuclear program. There was always this idea that if Israel went and bombed Iran, that there'd be a massive response from Hezbollah. So this question, which we just talked about, okay, well, in a sense, resolution looks more achievable because of Resolution 1701, and there is a sort of framework for what that might look like diplomatically. Of course, Iran doesn't want to let that happen. The actions of Iran throughout the past year are another thing which I think we really have to think very seriously about. And does it mean, obviously for Israel, I mean, conflict with Iran has been a fact of life for the past year, and it's escalated at certain points in April last week as well. But it's a big question for Western countries, for example, in considering, okay, are we going to help Israel defend itself from Iran? Well, the answer to that in April and last week was yes.
Sure.
The Americans, and then in April, UK and France, actively helped militarily to defend Israel from Iranian missiles and drones. But, if Israel now decides to attack on a large scale, that's a big question in a way, looking forward to the week.
Yeah.
That is the big question. And very important in this is we now know that the Israeli Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, is going to Washington on Tuesday for meetings on Wednesday with the US Defense Secretary. Now, there's a lot of commentary about this in the Israeli press, some even suggesting that if there is going to be military action, it will be joint US-Israeli military action against Iran, which really would up the ante. I'm not sure about that. But what I think is clear is there is an active negotiation in which all sorts of things might be under consideration. For example, continued supplies of weapons, other types of US support. So the idea of a sort of immediate kind of knee-jerk Israeli reaction is clearly passing. We're already several days past what happened with this large-scale Iranian missile attack. And the scope of it is still, I think, very unclear. The Americans are clearly trying to do everything they can to persuade Israel not to go for the oil installations, not to go for the nuclear. And they're going to incentivize that in various ways. So that is the thing we'll see unfolding this week.
I mean, in very, in very basic terms, Israel and Iran are quite far apart. They've got there's a lot of other countries in the middle. So I mean, you would think there's no prospect of actual skirmishes between troops. So we're talking about a war of missiles, of bombing runs, of drones.
Well, there are radicals in Iran who say if we have a war with Israel, we should mobilize an army of hundreds of thousands and march across Iraq and Syria and try and attack Israel by land. I mean, a lot of people don't, think that's particularly likely. They certainly have a very powerful missile arsenal. But I think in the event of an all-out confrontation, I don't think the idea of it suddenly taking on a form on land can be excluded.
Right.
I think possibly that's one of the reasons why, going back sort of 10 days, the Israelis chose to mobilise more of their army, was just in case, I think. I'm not sure they need all those soldiers for Lebanon.
Right.
So, yeah, potentially the scales here are enormous. I mean, the Iranian, Revolutionary Guard generals have been talking about taking out Israel's power stations, how easy that would be. And yes, it's true, there aren't very many of them. And the kind of accuracy they displayed last Tuesday, not great when hitting an airbase. But, a power station is a much more fragile, easier target. So, if all that started to happen, I think we could very seriously... the crisis could intensify very seriously.
What are the broader geopolitical implications here? In that we know that, of course, America is deeply intertwined with Israel and involved in Israel. Whatever Israel is doing, it will be done, one would think, with some degree of consultation with America, and America's stake and interest, and as indeed the West's stakes and interests are quite easy to see. What about Iran? What is Iran's relations with Russia like? What's the danger of Russia being brought in to this conflict?
Yeah, well, I think this is quite important to understanding. I think a lot of people, maybe particularly the people who might have been marching on Saturday, find it incomprehensible why the British government isn't more, active in trying to curb what Israel is doing. And I think there's an interesting gap between what you might call elite opinion, particularly among the securocrats, the defense, intelligence, foreign policy people, because they've been on a bit of a journey and they've come to see Iran actively helping Russia in Ukraine, for example. China doing the same, not quite in the same way, not sending missiles in the way that Iran has recently, but providing lots of microchips and sub-assemblies for drones and all this sort of stuff. And then North Korea too. And they refer to this as the axis of autocracies. And I think this has really changed the mood music, certainly in Washington, but I think also in European capitals. And, I was moderately surprised in April when the RAF was scrambled to try and bring down drones over Jordan. Now, I think the logic was partly to stop everything getting worse, but it was also partly, I think, because there are quite a lot of people now in the key Western capitals, Paris, London, Washington, D.C., who do see this emergent network of challenger powers. They worry a lot, for example, about a simultaneous challenge to the US from Russia, Iran, and China. And that, America in that situation could be overwhelmed in terms of where to put the carriers or the aircraft or whatever. So it is an important part, I think, of the context of the past year.
Fascinating. Well, look, there are other countries, and so let's talk about one of them. France has a budget due this week.
Yes, look, I always like to try and end on something a bit different, and I don't expect the listener to be interested if, they put another euro on a pack of Gauloises later this week in the French budget. But I tell you why it's interesting. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if Rachel Reeves thinks she's got problems getting the sums to add up when the UK budget comes at the end of this month, boy, oh boy. I mean, they're talking about 40 billion cuts, euros, to public services and 20 billion tax increases. So a net 60 billion euro adjustment to the public finances.
Huge,
yeah, it's 2 or 3 times what the UK government is looking at in terms of a black hole or whatever. It is widely expected that these cuts to public services will touch off large-scale protest, ferment, and all the rest of it. And so I mention it because, A, we will get the sense of whether France is in that budgetary and financial sense governable for the remainder of the Macron term. We'd start to get that this week. But also because, as our near neighbour, stuff that goes on there, it might even turn into an air traffic controllers strike, so you're getting on holiday or whatever, does tend to affect us in various ways.
Correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but aren't there EU implications there as well? That
Yeah,
part of what they're
absolutely.
doing, they're obliged to do because of EU
Yeah,
membership.
because they've run these huge deficits. They've been breaking EU rules on this for years, and frankly, this is where the EU has really slipped up in not gripping the French a bit more energetically. But as we know, they're one of the key members of the EU. But yes, the amount of public borrowing they do, or borrowing in order to fund public spending, has been way over the line that the EU sets, and that is one of the key reasons why Michel Barnier, who we remember from Brexit, the new Prime Minister, is trying to cut 40 billion out of spending when he presents his budget later this week.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark Urban. And you can, of course, hear Mark every time, this time every Monday, and you can read him in the Sunday Times every week, and do so. This week he was writing about the Middle East, and it's an essential read, I'd say. Thank you very much, Mark. Well, the one-year anniversary of Hamas's October the 7th attacks in Israel are to be commemorated in a debate in Parliament later today. The Labour MP John Pearce is the new chair of the Labour Friends of Israel. He's going to be leading that debate, and he joins me now. John, hello.
Hi, Hugo. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks very much for being with us. Why did you feel it was important that MPs got to speak on the anniversary today?
Well, look, this was the darkest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. It's absolutely vital that our Parliament and MPs across the House have the opportunity to come together and remember the lives lost, and also the hostages that were taken and those that are still held by Hamas.
Right. Okay. Sure. I mean, Keir Starmer, he vowed to unequivocally stand with the Jewish community and unite as a country in a statement released today. We have heard that I think it's 5,500 anti-Semitic incidents were recorded in the UK in the last year, which is a sort of a 3 times magnification from last year. And police, I think, are investigating an incident in Hove today after footage was shared online of a man damaging a memorial to victims of the attacks. Should MPs be doing more to unite the country to basically be trying to sort of dampen this stuff down?
Absolutely welcome the Prime Minister's statement today. It was absolutely shocking that what we've seen since the 7th of October has been a huge surge in anti-Semitic incidents. And that happened even before Israel had started its military response. It's depressing that we've had the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents in any sort of 12-month period, and this debate will help shine a light on that. And we absolutely welcome the government's firm stance on cracking down on anti-Semitism and supporting the police in doing so.
Sure. The British society has been much divided over the last year, both in the immediate response to these attacks and in the later response to these attacks, and indeed over the attacks themselves quite often. And it often feels that no part of it is more divided than the Labour Party. There are one hears quite a lot from people who are within Labour who are not only opposed to maybe much of what Labour Friends of Israel believes, certainly on the left, if not the Labour Party, not only opposed to much of what Labour Friends of Israel believes, but sort of opposed to the very notion that there should be such a body as Labour Friends of Israel at all. Is that a worry to you?
I don't recognise that. The Labour Friends of Israel has always been an organisation within the Labour Party that is committed to a two-state solution, and it is Labour Party policy, and there is huge consistency and agreement that that is the only way that we will achieve peace. We all agree within the Labour Party that we need a ceasefire. We all agree that we need a surge in aid, and then we need a path to a sustainable long-term peace. And Labour Friends of Israel is the way in which MPs can come together and to make the case for that. So no, I don't recognise that description at all.
Is it conceivable to you that Labour Friends of Israel would one day stop being friends with Israel? We've seen because we've seen other sort of friends of groups across various parties, which basically relations with the country of which they are friends disintegrate to the degree that they decide that these groups can no longer exist. Again, is that a worry for you that we may reach a stage where Israel's actions in Gaza and Israel's actions in Lebanon and perhaps Israel's actions elsewhere make you no longer feel so friendly?
I mean, the reality is that we are Labour friends of Israel. That doesn't not necessarily mean we are Labour friends of whichever government happens to be in charge of Israel at any one time. Israel is a vital ally to the UK, and also, most importantly, a liberal democracy in the Middle East, and it's vital that we maintain that relationship. And we will continue to do so. But we are a critical friend, and always have been. And I think that's actually very helpful that we're able to have that grown up relationship, because, as I say, we are absolutely committed to a two-state solution. That's the Labour Party policy, and that's where we won't defer from that. And it doesn't matter what the government of Israel is or saying. We will continue to be a critical friend, because they are such an important ally.